and welcome to the Safri Private Wealth Podcast. I'm Leonora Stevens, a private wealth partner based in Bristol. I'm joined by Mike Hodges, a fellow private wealth partner based in our Manchester office. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Leo.
Today we have a special guest, Philip Radford, a director from our Guernsey and Dubai office. Welcome, Phil.
Hi, Leo. Great to be here.
So join us each episode for in-depth discussions on private wealth matters, from estate planning and trusts to retirement and gifting strategies. We're here to provide some practical tips to help grow and protect your wealth. And please don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Today, we will be discussing the role of a trustee. What is a trustee? What's their role and what responsibilities do they have? What are good traits of a trustee? And should people have trustees in the UK or based in an international finance centre, such as Guernsey? In my role as a private wealth advisor, I see many combinations when it comes to trustees. So for some clients, for example, you might have a mum and dad and they've settled a trust for the benefit of their children, and they are the sole trustees, just the two of them, and that keeps matters very simple. Others, they may have the adult children of the mum and dad in my example who set up the trust, or they may have a professional trustee such as a lawyer or an accountant, a trusted family friend, or also some may have professional trustees overseas. Mike, as a starting point, would you like to summarise the role of a trustee?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is, yes, there are duties, but it's not as scary as it sounds, and doesn't have to have the kind of formality. So I'm sitting here holding this pencil. I could declare a trust over this pencil for you, Leo, and for Phil, and I've created a trust as there's some legal formalities. So it could be as simple as this. So in your example, mum and dad say, right, we're holding these family assets on behalf of our children. They can be their own trustees. We get into lots of technical things about whether they should benefit from their own trust. Answer is almost always no, you shouldn't. You should exclude yourselves as a settlor from benefiting, but you can have situations. But it can be as simple as them saying that they hold assets on trust for their children. Then you can get to layers of complication, say, right, we want professionals. And that's because the responsibility is you're no longer holding the asset for your own benefit. So this pencil, I'm now holding for your benefit. I shouldn't enjoy it at all. So if I start scribbling notes, you can stop me midstream and say, no. So that's the key, that you're slicing and dicing ownership, so that even though I may be the owner, it's someone else who's benefiting from that. So they're very common, despite lots of changes that have made them perhaps less popular, very common in family situations. And then you can have a trust as an individual, a trust corporation, a company, whatever combination. And I've got clients with all of those. And then typically you're holding for the benefit of your beneficiaries. They can come to you and say, oh, please, would you help me out with buying a new house or whatever it might be. But in most situations, and there are all sorts of different flavors of trust, and some the so-called life tenant is entitled to income as it arises, and you've got prescribed capital beneficiaries. But in a discretionary trust, the trustees just have to say, right, well, we've heard what you say, and yes or no, we're inclined to accede to your request for some money or not. And I suppose the other key thing, and this is where regulation has tightened, because I'm holding for the benefit of someone else, the trustees are holding for someone else's benefit, then they have to do the right thing. They have to make sure that they are generating income for income beneficiaries, preserving and increasing the value of capital. So all of those things that we would label, or the lawyers and we would label as fiduciary duties, are the things that the trustees have to be mindful of. They can't just sit there and fritter everything, go down to the bookies and put it on the 230 at Haydock. Haydock being a northern racecourse for those of you who are in the south or not in the UK. So that's kind of a bit of context.
And I suppose the trustees are often, it's up to the settlor how, or sort of which trustees are appointed, and then
yes,
looking at who they appoint. Phil, we said that from the simplest way is mum and dad, but some people would like professional trustees. So what would be the benefit of having a professional trustee over your neighbour next door, for example?
Obviously I'm a professional trustee, so I'm going to have lots of things to say here. But just to echo some of what Mike said, it is often useful and or pertinent for family members to act as a trustee. And there is a balance between that. You could have a family member as a protector, and we're not necessarily here to talk about protectors, but there are other roles you can give to make sure that family members have some say in what happens, or powers are reserved to the settlors, so that they can have some say in what happens with the assets if they're nervous about giving all of their assets away to a professional, an unknown entity, a professional trustee. In terms of the benefits, as I say, there are many, but to highlight a few, experience of acting in a fiduciary capacity is a really key issue. Mike's just touched on that. The difference between the mindset that you have when you make those decisions and the fact that you have to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries, especially where those interests aren't aligned. I mean, even every good trustee gets to the point sometimes where they have a dispute within the trust, and sometimes you may have to act and do something that's not in your own interests because it is in the interest of the beneficiaries, and that takes some discipline to do that. And so to have that experience and the knowledge of how to do that and how to navigate those difficult times in particular can be really valuable if you're using a professional trustee. Just the general expertise and knowledge, you know, as a trustee, trustees have become increasingly complex over the years. When they first started out, they were a really simple or relatively simple idea of holding assets on someone else's behalf. You know, Mike's pencil analogy, it isn't daft. You could just have a single asset that you're saying, I'm holding for someone else. It's no longer mine. But they have over the years been involved in more so in really complex structuring with a wide range of assets. So having that tax awareness and knowing what to do in reporting requirements, so your sort of day-to-day things that you need to do, knowing how to make sure that assets are well custodied and insured, and knowing how to make sure that any advisors that you appoint, such as investment advisors, are well vetted, that they're suitable, that you review the performance of the trust investments and the suitability of any mandates that are put in place. All those things that we deal with day to day and we take for granted, whereas if you're a family member or a non-professional trustee, you probably could do all of that, and you could cover all of that, but I think there's more chance of things slipping through the net or tripping up. So horses for courses, there will be instances where family members are perfectly adept and suitable choices, and then other times when you might go for a professional trustee. But one of the things that a professional trustee should have is a really strong network of tried and tested advisors, so discretionary investment managers, banking expertise, tax and compliance, legal matters, real estate matters, whatever the assets of the trust are, they should have access to that. And then probably finally, the key one to highlight, insurance and independence. If something goes wrong in your trust and you have a family member as a trustee, the beneficiaries could effectively enforce a lawsuit against the trustee. That could be really, really difficult on two accounts. Number one, the relationships between the parties, obviously, but secondly, the access to assets. A professional trustee should have good indemnity insurance, like any professional advisor. And if and when something goes wrong, and unfortunately it does from time to time, the beneficiary should have recourse and the ability to be able to access that, and that won't exist, or that's highly unlikely to exist if you've got private trustees.
Very good point. And then obviously your area is one of your areas is the international side of things. Someone down the golf club says, "Oh, I've got an offshore trustee or trustee from Jersey, Guernsey," or what are the benefits of having a trustee from an international finance centre such as Jersey, Dubai, Switzerland, for example?
I mean, I think first and foremost is just the experience level and the infrastructure that's going to exist in those places. I mean, a lot of the more established international finance centres have been around for 50 years or more, and so you're going to have access to a wide range of trustees, all of whom should be very qualified, knowledgeable. Their staff should be vetted, qualified, knowledgeable, experienced. So first and foremost is just the accessibility of those international finance centres and what that gives you. I mean, it's slightly touching on my last point I made in the last comment around insurance, and it's the regulatory environment in those international finance centres. It's extremely robust. There's strong supervision, and the reputation of the international finance centres is really, really important to them. So there's regular engagement with regulators, and they ensure that trustees are following best practice. There is enforcement against trustees who don't act in the right way, who don't follow the regulations, and who don't follow best practice. And I guess that follows on to the court systems. The courts in the international finance centres are very used to dealing with trust and trustee and trust matters. And so you've got many, many years of what we call good jurisprudence, predictable decisions. If you're a beneficiary, then you'll know that you've got access to both the regulatory environment and the courts as an oversight. So I think that's a really good benefit for clients who are looking at that. And then probably my final point to make would be around reputation and perception. We've seen, even in international finance centres, some of the Caribbean and Panama, which historically was one of the big and popular ones, we've seen data leaks and hacks over the last decade or so. So we've seen the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, etc. And so whilst that may make people think that data is more accessible when it's in an international finance centre, data isn't more accessible. But if data is accessible anywhere, the reality is any server can be hacked, any data is potentially going to be out there on the web. And if that happens, what's the perception of that? And you have to view whether the perception of an international finance centre is negative, because it's seen as a place where tax avoidance takes place and you have all the negative connotations, or positive in that you're in a well-regulated jurisdiction where your affairs have been really scrutinized and you should be up to date with your tax filings and all the legal matters. So the international finance centers are making huge strides to make sure that the quality of the product is very, very good and consistent. And I think that whole point of why you have a trust, most people these days are setting up trust with us for succession planning and asset protection, and tax benefits are being minimalized. So I think there's been a swing in perception that if you're in an international finance center, it's a good thing, because you are adopting the highest possible standards of tax compliance and following the rules and regulations.
I suppose it all depends, doesn't it? Every client is different and every client scenario. So, if you have a fully UK-based client with a relatively simple trust, they probably don't need that extra support. Whereas where you might have internationally mobile beneficiaries or settlors, they would and a much more complicated structure within that, then you would need more. You would probably be after that more detailed expertise that you would have in the International Finance Centre.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would echo that 100%. I speak to many prospective clients where I tell them quite early on in a conversation that I don't think the right solution for them is us or an international finance centre. I think they have much simpler, sounds like dumbing it down, but I don't think their requirements will mean that they get the benefit from everything that an international finance centre can bring. And let's be honest, it's probably more expensive. You're paying more for something that you're not using. So, if you're tootling to the shops and back in your Ferrari every day, you might enjoy the experience, but you're paying an awful lot for it. So whilst international finance centres with their depth of experience will be and the practical things they can bring will be useful, if you're not using them and you're paying for them, it's probably not worth it. So horses for courses, to extend Mike's analogy of race courses, it's important that people make the right decision to find the right type of trustee from the outset of the relationship.
Yeah. And this is a question for both Mike and Phil. We sort of briefly touched on a few of the points about sort of experience, but what do you think would be the good attributes of a trustee? Say you're thinking about settling a trust, what should they be looking for when appointing that trustee?
Should I kick off on that? I mean, I think I've written down here with the pencil. It's now hard in trust. I shouldn't be using it anymore, should I? The clues in the names. It's someone you can trust. You're clearly not going to entrust valuable assets with someone you think might not be the person you would deal with them. And I guess a lot of this goes back to, if you look at a personal level, and we should probably draw the distinction between, family or trusted family friend. It's someone who you think would do what you would have done. So there's an element of saying control. So it might be someone who's a generation younger that you can trust. It's got to be someone who is strong, because they could be challenged if they've got duties to do, and they're not always going to be saying yes, 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 yes. So they might have to say to their beneficiaries at some point, no, sorry, I've heard what you say, but I'm not inclined to do what you want. And I've got a couple of client situations I could think of where trustees are having to be quite, shall we say, robust. So I think that then leads you on to saying, well, does that make it better. And I would say quite often, yes, that you want professionals. And that's where you sort of get into Phil's world. And he's saying, right, what kind of professional you want? I'd guess similar to us, Leo, someone you've got strong relationships with, someone you think is there for the long term, that you've got continuity. You don't want trustees chopping and changing at the drop of a hat. So I think you could clearly get comfortable with who your trustees are going to be, because they might be holding the family value, the value of the family assets for decades. So I think that's why I would say, if you're using professional trustees, shop around. I'm not doing a sales pitch for you, Phil, but we've had this discussion before we started the recording, and I know you are a trustee on a couple of my client situations, or you and the team in Guernsey. So it warrants some serious thinking, because you're dealing with long-term scenarios. So it's trust, it's relationships, and someone who will be strong and experienced. I've blathered on for long enough, Phil. What are your thoughts on that?
You've covered the range of the initial thought points that everybody should have in terms of a trustee. Mike, I'm going to echo something you said. You say a strong trustee who can say no. We talk often about being a robust trustee, and that is the ability to make the right long-term decision despite the noise and pressure that comes around short-termism. So somebody wants something now, but it might not be the best thing for the family as a whole, and making those decisions can be really, really difficult. Obviously, a trustee will be guided by maybe a letter of wishes from a settlor, or perhaps the settlor is still alive. You can have a discussion with them about what their wants might be in certain circumstances, and that could be at least guiding in your decision making. But often trustees have to make unpopular decisions, and particularly where families are involved. I mean, we do corporate trust work as well, and that perhaps is a little less pertinent here. But where families are involved, and assets and wealth are involved, it's probably not surprising to hear that people often fall out. And so where you've got one side wanting something and another side wanting something else, you can't please all of the people all the time, and you're going to make unpopular decisions. But I think it's about having a trustee who can be consistent and considered. So whilst a beneficiary may not agree with their decision, at least they can see a pattern of consistency, and they can understand where the trustee is coming from. And that again, Mike, because you've covered so many good points, it covers the continuity point as well. If you can have a trustee who is going to be around for the long term, and whether if that's a corporate, it could be a number of individuals within that corporate, but at least they have the corporate memory and the records and the knowledge of what's gone on in the past and why.
Yeah.
But that can be extremely helpful, because it can mean not only are you not starting a new relationship with a new trustee all the time, as you might be if people die or can no longer act in the role as a trustee. If you have that corporate, you've got the benefit of the consistency that you're going to get. And I think continuity is really important. And then the other one that I would obviously talk about, and I've slightly touched on, is just the experience factor. By having a good trustee, they should understand you and your family, but also the assets that you have and the aspirations that you have. And there are so many different assets put into trust these days. For example, we deal a lot with digital assets and crypto. And that's not something that every trustee can or does deal with. So if that's what you've got and you need a trustee to act for you, find the trustee who can demonstrate that they've got the experience in that asset class, and they've got, I touched before on the wide range of advisors and the infrastructure that you have, the custodians, etc. Find the trustee and vet a potential trustee to make sure that they've got all of that. So in the very simplest situations, as we talked about earlier, Leo, you don't need to worry about these things, but where you have more complexity, then the choice of trustee becomes even more important. And I think that getting that right means that you should take your time, and as Mike said, speak to a number of trustees and find the right one for you. But at the end of the day, it's about striking up a relationship and finding an affinity with somebody. It should be a long-term relationship, and you want to work with somebody that you feel trust in and that you feel that you can do that with.
Yeah. Well, I'm relatively comfortable. Sorry, Leo. I was just going to say, I'm relatively comfortable holding this pencil as trustee, because I think my obligations are probably fairly limited, and I'm not going to fall into some kind of trap of beneficiaries suing me and saying, well, hang on, what ever happened to that valuable pencil that you declared a trust on the 16th of May 2025?
I think, Mike, the example that we see most often that causes complexity is family businesses. If you
Yeah.
put a family business in trust and perhaps it's a multi-generational family business, then people are going to fall out, because when you combine work and family, very often people aren't going to agree on every level. And so then when that asset or the shares of that sit within a trust, that's where being a trustee becomes much more difficult, because you are constantly navigating different views on things between the various relevant parties.
And Phil, as your role as a professional trustee, do you want to give, I mean, we've had a few examples, but, do you want to give a couple of examples ranging from sort of simple to complex of what you might get involved in? Say, we've said about the difficult family dynamics, but what you would do in your capacity as a trustee for some of your clients?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the very simplest examples are probably existing assets that are placed onto a trust. So the trusts are generally set up in one of two ways. Either somebody has a piece of property or an investment portfolio, and they say, I want to put this thing in a trust, and they'll come to us and say, can I place this in a trust with you? And we look at that asset, and the implication is that's probably a long-term asset. It's been held for a long time, and it's likely that they're going to want to continue to hold it. So you can get the mechanisms in place from the outset to understand and to make sure that you can continue to hold that. So that's like Mike's pencil scenario. It's unlikely if somebody's holding that for you, you're going to say, well, maybe you should sell it and buy something else to make a better financial return. So those are probably the simplest ones, because you know right from the outset what everybody's getting into, and you know what the long-term path is likely to look like. There may be some small moves along the way, but for example, if you're holding the family estate, and I know you guys do a lot of work with landed estates and generational ownership of those assets. If that asset is put into trust, it's very unlikely that the beneficiaries and indeed the settlor are going to want you to have regular dialogue with them about the investment performance and whether or not the asset should be sold. So those are generally one of the simpler ones, because when those mechanisms are put in place, it's more of a preservation. It's about sitting on that asset and doing the best that you can with what you've got. And that may mean looking at generating additional revenue streams and what you can do with the land, etc. But it's a slightly narrower scope than some of the situations that we get involved in. So the very simplest ones are usually existing assets that are held for the long term. The more complex ones are usually, I touched on family businesses, multinational businesses, and those trusts that hold multiple investment classes. And we have many trusts for families where there are a wide variety of assets that we hold. Private equity has been a really popular thing over the last few years. It's a great diversifier from public markets. We hold a huge amount of private equity for our clients. Real estate as an asset class, whether it's investment, development, or long-term, short-term, is a complex asset class with a huge amount of issues that you need to be well advised on. Trophy assets in real estate like hotels and things that we often get asked to buy by clients. Crypto, which I already touched on, which for us is a relatively unusual thing for trustees to be doing, but for us is a reasonable part of what we do now for clients. So crypto and digital assets, the complexities that come around that. And then things like cars and art and diamonds and those sort of more esoteric asset classes, where they're either settled into a trust or you're approached and asked to consider buying those. We have a lot of clients who buy art, where most of their value of their assets is wrapped up in a trust structure. They're often coming to us saying, I like this piece, would you consider buying it? And as a trustee, that has so many facets of complexity around, it's an illiquid asset. The market in it could be really, really thin. The valuations could vary wildly depending on what it is that you're buying and the accessibility of it. You've got insurance issues, you've got tax issues, you've got where it's held and situs and all sorts of things. So I would say the complex is really around the variety of things that you can do in any one structure, and particularly when you bring in international facets to that. So you may have real estate and businesses in far-flung parts of the world.
Very interesting. Thanks. I mean, I think Mike and I often talk about succession planning and IHT and trusts, and so this has been really hopefully useful to our listeners to sort of delve deeper into what they should think about. Yes, it's great to think about what assets they should get across, what they're trying to achieve, but then also they need to think about the underlying trustees who will then hopefully sort of not fulfil their objectives, but they will act as trusted advisors, directing the assets as they intend them to do so when they set up the trust. So thank you very much, Mike and Phil, for joining me today. It's clear, as I say, it's a wide-ranging role that should be taken very seriously should you be asked to be a trustee. At Safri's and Safri Trust, we work with a wide range of clients both in the UK and overseas. We advise individuals and families on how best to safeguard, maintain and enhance their wealth, and on the most appropriate methods of passing on that wealth to the next generation. We also help people comply with their tax laws in the UK, which can be complex. It's important for me to mention that if you're considering any of the topics discussed today, you must always take professional advice based on your own circumstances. If you'd like to find out more about the services we offer at Safri, then please do visit our website at www.safri.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and leave us a review if you found this episode helpful. Thank you for listening.